The last chapter has been concerned with the contention that orthodoxy is not only, as is often urged, the only safe guardian of morality or order, but is also the only logical guardian of liberty, innovation, and advance. If we wish to pull down the prosperous oppressor, we cannot do it with the new doctrine of human perfectibility. We can do it with the old doctrine of original sin. If we want to uproot inherent cruelties or lift up lost populations, we cannot do it with the scientific theory that matter precedes mind. We can do it with the supernatural theory that mind precedes matter. If we wish specially to awaken people to social vigilance and tireless pursuit of practice, we cannot help it much by insisting on the immanent God and the inner light, for these are at best reasons for contentment. We can help it much by insisting on the transcendent God and the flying and escaping gleam, for that means divine discontent. If we wish particularly to assert the idea of a generous balance against that of a dreadful autocracy, we shall instinctively be Trinitarian rather than Unitarian. If we desire European civilization to be a raid and a rescue, we shall insist rather that souls are in real peril than that their peril is ultimately unreal. And if we wish to exalt the outcast and the crucified, we shall rather wish to think that a veritable God was crucified rather than a mere sage or hero. Above all, if we wish to protect the poor, we shall be in favor of fixed rules and clear dogmas. The rules of a club are occasionally in favor of the poor member. The drift of a club is always in favor of the rich one. And now we come to the crucial question which truly concludes the whole matter. A reasonable agnostic, if he has happened to agree with me so far, may justly turn round and say, "You have found a practical philosophy in the doctrine of the fall. Very well. You have found a side of democracy now dangerously neglected, wisely asserted in original sin. All right. You have found a truth in the doctrine of hell. I congratulate you. You are convinced that worshippers of a personal God look outwards and are progressive. I congratulate them. But even supposing that those doctrines do include those truths, why cannot you take the truths and leave the doctrines? Granted that all modern society is trusting the rich too much because it does not allow for human weakness. Granted that orthodox ages have had a great advantage because, believing in the fall, they did allow for human weakness. Why cannot you simply allow for human weakness without believing in the fall? If you have discovered that the idea of damnation represents a healthy idea of danger, why can you not simply take the idea of danger and leave the idea of damnation? If you can see clearly the kernel of common sense in the nut of Christian orthodoxy, why cannot you simply take the kernel and leave the nut? Why cannot you, to use that cant phrase of the newspapers which I, as a highly scholarly agnostic, am a little ashamed of using, why cannot you simply take what is good in Christianity, what you can define as valuable, what you can comprehend, and leave all the rest, all the absolute dogmas that are in their nature incomprehensible? This is the real question. This is the last question, and it is a pleasure to try to answer it. The first answer is simply to say that I am a rationalist. I like to have some intellectual justification for my intuitions. If I am treating man as a fallen being, it is an intellectual convenience to me to believe that he fell. And if I find, for some odd psychological reason, that I can deal better with a man's exercise of free will, if I believe that he has got it. But I am in this matter yet more definitely a rationalist. I do not propose to turn this book into one of ordinary Christian apologetics. I should be glad to meet at any other time the enemies of Christianity in that more obvious arena. Here I am only giving an account of my own growth in spiritual certainty. But I may pause to remark that the more I saw of the merely abstract arguments against the Christian cosmology, the less I thought of them. I mean that having found the moral atmosphere of the Incarnation to be common sense, I then looked at the established intellectual arguments against the Incarnation and found them to be common nonsense. In case the argument should be thought to suffer from the absence of the ordinary apologetic, I will here very briefly summarize my own arguments and conclusions on the purely objective or scientific truth of the matter. If I am asked, as a purely intellectual question, why I believe in Christianity, I can only answer, for the same reason that an intelligent agnostic disbelieves in Christianity. I believe in it quite rationally upon the evidence. But the evidence in my case, as in that of the intellectual agnostic, is not really in this or that alleged demonstration. It is in an enormous accumulation of small but unanimous facts. The secularist is not to be blamed because his objections to Christianity are miscellaneous and even scrappy. It is precisely such scrappy evidence that does convince the mind. I mean that a man may well be less convinced of a philosophy from 4 books than from 1 book, 1 battle, 1 landscape, and 1 old friend. The very fact that the things are of different kinds increases the importance of the fact that they all point to one conclusion. Now, the non-Christianity of the average educated man today is almost always, to do him justice, made up of these loose but living experiences. I can only say that my evidences for Christianity are of the same vivid but varied kind as his evidences against it, for when I look at these various anti-Christian truths, I simply discover that none of them are true. I discover that the true tide and force of all the facts flows the other way. Let us take cases. Many a sensible modern man must have abandoned Christianity under the pressure of 3 such converging convictions as these. First, that men, with their shape, structure, and sexuality, are, after all, very much like beasts, a mere variety of the animal kingdom. Second, that primeval religion arose in ignorance and fear. Third, that priests have blighted societies with bitterness and gloom. Those 3 anti-Christian arguments are very different, but they are all quite logical and legitimate, and they all converge. The only objection to them, I discover, is that they are all untrue. If you leave off looking at books about beasts and men, if you begin to look at beasts and men, then, if you have any humor or imagination, any sense of the frantic or the farcical, you will observe that the startling thing is not how like man is to the brutes, but how unlike he is. It is the monstrous scale of his divergence that requires an explanation. That man and brute are like is, in a sense, a truism, but that being so like they should then be so insanely unlike, that is the shock and the enigma. That an ape has hands is far less interesting to the philosopher than the fact that, having hands, he does next to nothing with them, does not play knucklebones or the violin, does not carve marble or carve mutton. People talk of barbaric architecture and debased art, but elephants do not build colossal temples of ivory, even in a rococo style. Camels do not paint even bad pictures, though equipped with the material of many camels' hair brushes. Certain modern dreamers say that ants and bees have a society superior to ours. They have indeed a civilization, but that very truth only reminds us that it is an inferior civilization. Who ever found an ant-hill decorated with the statues of celebrated ants? Who has seen a beehive carved with the images of gorgeous queens of old? No. The chasm between man and other creatures may have a natural explanation, but it is a chasm. We talk of wild animals, but man is the only wild animal. It is man that has broken out. All other animals are tame animals, following the rugged respectability of the tribe or type. All other animals are domestic animals. Man alone is ever undomestic, either as a profligate or a monk. So that this first superficial reason for materialism is, if anything, a reason for its opposite. It is exactly where biology leaves off that all religion begins. It would be the same if I examined the second of the 3 chance rationalist arguments, the argument that all that we call divine began in some darkness and terror. When I did attempt to examine the foundations of this modern idea, I simply found that there were none. Science knows nothing whatever about prehistoric man, for the excellent reason that he is prehistoric. A few professors choose to conjecture that such things as human sacrifice were once innocent and general, and that they gradually dwindled, but there is no direct evidence of it, and the small amount of indirect evidence is very much the other way. In the earliest legends we have, such as the tales of Isaac and of Iphigenia, human sacrifice is not introduced as something old, but rather as something new, as a strange and frightful exception darkly demanded by the gods. History says nothing, and legends all say that the earth was kinder in its earliest time. There is no tradition of progress, but the whole human race has a tradition of the fall. Amusingly enough, indeed, the very dissemination of this idea is used against its authenticity. Learned men literally say that this prehistoric calamity cannot be true because every race of mankind remembers it. I cannot keep pace with these paradoxes. And if we took the third chance instance, it would be same, the view that priests darken and embitter the world. I look at the world and simply discover that they don't. Those countries in Europe which are still influenced by priests are exactly the countries where there is still singing and dancing and colored dresses and art in the open air. Catholic doctrine and discipline may be walls, but they are the walls of a playground. Christianity is the only frame which has preserved the pleasure of paganism. We might fancy some children playing on the flat grassy top of some tall island in the sea. So long as there was a wall round the cliff's edge, They could fling themselves into every frantic game and make the place the noisiest of nurseries. But the walls were knocked down, leaving the naked peril of the precipice. They did not fall over, but when their friends returned to them, they were all huddled in terror in the center of the island, and their song had ceased. Thus these three facts of experience, such facts as go to make an agnostic, are, in this view, turned totally round. I am left saying, give me an explanation first of the towering eccentricity of man among the brutes, second, of the vast human tradition of some ancient happiness, third, of the partial perpetuation of such pagan joy in the countries of the Catholic Church. One explanation, at any rate, covers all three. The theory that twice was the natural order interrupted by some explosion or revelation such as people now call psychic. Once, heaven came upon the earth with a power or seal called the image of God, whereby man took command of nature, and once again, when in empire after empire men had been found wanting, heaven came to save mankind in the awful shape of a man. This would explain why the mass of men always look backwards, and why the only corner where they in any sense look forwards is the little continent where Christ has his church. I know it will be said that Japan has become progressive, but how can this be an answer when even in saying Japan has become progressive, we really only mean Japan has become European? But I wish here not so much to insist on my own explanation as to insist on my original remark. I agree with the ordinary unbelieving man in the street in being guided by 3 or 4 odd facts, all pointing to something, only when I came to look at the facts I always found they pointed to something else. I have given an imaginary triad of such ordinary anti-Christian arguments. If that be too narrow a basis, I will give on the spur of the moment another. These are the kind of thoughts which in combination create the impression that Christianity is something weak and diseased. First, for instance, that Jesus was a gentle creature, sheepish and unworldly, a mere ineffectual appeal to the world. Second, that Christianity arose and flourished in the dark ages of ignorance, and that to these the Church would drag us back. Third, that the people are still strongly religious, or, if you will, superstitious. Such people as the Irish are weak, unpractical, and behind the times. I only mention these ideas to affirm the same thing, that when I looked into them independently, I found, not that the conclusions were unphilosophical, but simply that the facts were not facts. Instead of looking at books and pictures about the New Testament, I looked at the New Testament. There I found an account, not in the least of a person with his hair parted in the middle, or his hands clasped in appeal, but of an extraordinary being with lips of thunder and acts of lurid decision, flinging down tables, casting out devils, passing with the wild secrecy of the wind from mountain isolation to a sort of dreadful demagogy, a being who often acted like an angry god, and always like a god. Christ had even a literary style of his own, not to be found, I think, elsewhere. It consists of an almost furious use of the a fortiori. His "how much more" is piled one upon another like castle upon castle in the clouds. The diction used about Christ has been, and perhaps wisely, sweet and submissive, but the diction used by Christ is quite curiously gigantesque. It is full of camels leaping through needles, and mountains hurled into the sea. Morally, it is equally terrific. He called himself a sword of slaughter, and told men to buy swords if they sold their coats for them. That he used other even wilder words on the side of non-resistance greatly increases the mystery, but it also, if anything, rather increases the violence. We cannot even explain it by calling such a being insane, for insanity is usually along one consistent channel. The maniac is generally a monomaniac. Here we must remember the difficult definition of Christianity already given. Christianity is a superhuman paradox whereby two opposite passions may blaze beside each other. The one explanation of the gospel language that does explain it is that it is the survey of one who, from some supernatural height, beholds some more startling synthesis. I take in order the next instance offered, the idea that Christianity belongs to the Dark Ages. Here I did not satisfy myself with reading modern generalizations. I read a little history, and in history I found that Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. It was a shining bridge connecting two shining civilizations. If anyone says that the faith arose in ignorance and savagery, the answer is simple. It didn't. It arose in the Mediterranean civilization in the full summer of the Roman Empire. The world was swarming with skeptics, and pantheism was as plain as the sun when Constantine nailed the cross to the mast. It is perfectly true that afterwards the ship sank, but it is far more extraordinary that the ship came up again, repainted and glittering, with the cross still at the top. This is the amazing thing the religion did. It turned a sunken ship into a submarine. The ark lived under the load of waters. After being buried under the debris of dynasties and clans, we arose and remembered Rome. If our faith had been a mere fad of the fading empire, fad would have followed fad in the twilight, and if the civilization ever re-emerged, and many such have never re-emerged, it would have been under some new barbaric flag. But the Christian Church was the last life of the old society, and was also the first life of the new. She took the people who were forgetting how to make an arch, and she taught them to invent the Gothic arch. In a word, the most absurd thing that could be said of the Church is the thing we have all heard said of it. How can we say that the Church wishes to bring us back into the Dark Ages? The Church was the only thing that ever brought us out of them. I added in this second trinity of objections an idle instance taken from those who feel such people as the Irish to be weakened or made stagnant by superstition. I only added it because this is a peculiar case of a statement of fact that turns out to be a statement of falsehood. It is constantly said of the Irish that they are impractical, but if we refrain for a moment from looking at what is said about them and look at what is done about them, we shall see that the Irish are not only practical, but quite painfully successful. The poverty of their country, the minority of their members, are simply the conditions under which they were asked to work, but no other group in the British Empire has done so much with such conditions. The Nationalists were the only minority that ever succeeded in twisting the whole British Parliament sharply out of its path. The Irish peasants are the only poor men in these islands who have forced their masters to disgorge. These people, whom we call priest-ridden, are the only Britons who will not be squire-ridden. And when I came to look at the actual Irish character, the case was the same. Irishmen are best at the specially hard professions, the trades of iron, the lawyer, and the soldier. In all these cases, therefore, I came back to the same conclusion. The sceptic was quite right to go by the facts, only he had not looked at the facts. The sceptic is too credulous. He believes in newspapers or even in encyclopedias. Again, the three questions left me with three very antagonistic questions. The average sceptic wanted to know how I explained the namby-pamby note in the gospel, the connection of the creed with medieval darkness, and the political impracticability of the Celtic Christians. But I wanted to ask, and to ask with an earnestness amounting to urgency, what is this incomparable energy which appears first in one walking the earth like a living judgment, and this energy which can die with a dying civilization and yet force it to a resurrection from the dead? This energy which last of all can inflame a bankrupt peasantry with so fixed a faith in justice that they get what they ask while others go empty away, so that the most helpless island of the empire can actually help itself. There is an answer. It is an answer to say that the energy is truly from outside the world, that it is psychic, or at least one of the results of a real psychical disturbance. The highest gratitude and respect are due to the great human civilizations, such as the old Egyptian or the existing Chinese. Nevertheless, it is no injustice for them to say that only modern Europe has exhibited incessantly a power of self-renewal, recurring often at the shortest intervals and descending to the smallest facts of building or costume. All other societies die finally and with dignity. We die daily. We are always being born again, with almost indecent obstetrics. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that there is in historic Christendom a sort of unnatural life. It could be explained as a supernatural life. It could be explained as an awful galvanic life, working in what would have been a corpse. For our civilization ought to have died by all parallels, by all sociological probability, in the Ragnarok at the end of Rome. This is the weird inspiration of our estate. You and I have no business to be here at all. We are all revenants. All living Christians are dead pagans walking about. Just as Europe was about to be gathered in silence to Assyria and Babylon, something entered into its body, and Europe has had a strange life. It is not too much to say that it has had the jumps ever since. I have dealt at length with such typical triads of doubt in order to convey the main contention, that my own case for Christianity is rational, but it is not simple. It is an accumulation of varied facts, like the attitude of the ordinary agnostic. But the ordinary agnostic has got his facts all wrong. He is a non-believer for a multitude of reasons, but they are untrue reasons. He doubts because the Middle Ages were barbaric, but they weren't. Because Darwinism is demonstrated, but it isn't. Because miracles do not happen, but they do. Because monks were lazy, but they were very industrious. Because nuns are unhappy, but they are particularly cheerful. Because Christian art was sad and pale, but it was picked out in peculiarly bright colors and gay with gold. because modern science is moving away from the supernatural, but it isn't. It is moving towards the supernatural with the rapidity of a railway train. But among these million facts all flowing one way, there is, of course, one question sufficiently solid and separate to be treated briefly, but by itself. I mean the objective occurrence of the supernatural. In another chapter I have indicated the fallacy of the ordinary supposition that the world must be impersonal because it is orderly. A person is just as likely to desire an orderly thing as a disorderly thing, but my own positive conviction that personal creation is more conceivable than material fate is, I admit, in a sense, undiscussable. I will not call it a faith or an intuition, for those words are mixed up with mere emotion. It is strictly an intellectual conviction, but it is a primary intellectual conviction, like the certainty of self or the good of living. Anyone who likes, therefore, may call my belief in God merely mystical. The phrase is not worth fighting about. But my belief that miracles have happened in human history is not a mystical belief at all. I believe in them upon human evidences, as I do in the discovery of America. Upon this point there is a simple logical fact that only requires to be stated and cleared up. Somehow or other an extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles consider them coldly and fairly, while believers in miracles accept them only in connection with some dogma. The fact is quite the other way. The believers in miracles accept them, rightly or wrongly, because they have evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them, rightly or wrongly, because they have a doctrine against them. The open, obvious, democratic thing is to believe an old apple woman when she bears testimony to a miracle, just as you believe an old apple woman when she bears testimony to a murder. The plain popular course is to trust the peasant's word about the ghost exactly as far as you trust the peasant's word about the landlord. Being a peasant, he will probably have a great deal of healthy agnosticism about both. Still, you could fill the British Museum with evidence uttered by the peasant and given in favour of the ghost. If it comes to human testimony, there is a choking cataract of human testimony in favour of the supernatural. If you reject it, you can only mean one of two things. You reject the peasant's story about the ghost either because the man is a peasant, or because the story is a ghost story. That is, you either deny the main principle of democracy, or you affirm the main principle of materialism, the abstract impossibility of miracle. You have a perfect right to do so, but in that case you are the dogmatist. It is we Christians who accept all actual evidence. It is you rationalists who refuse actual evidence, being constrained to do so by your creed. But I am not constrained by any creed in the matter, and looking impartially into certain miracles of medieval and modern times, I have come to the conclusion that they occurred. All argument against these plain facts is always argument in a circle. If I say, medieval documents attest certain miracles as much as they attest certain battles, they answer, but medievals were superstitious. If I want to know in what they were superstitious, the only ultimate answer is that they believed in the miracles. If I say, a peasant saw a ghost, I am told, but peasants are so credulous. If I ask, why credulous, the only answer is that they see ghosts. Iceland is impossible because only stupid sailors have seen it, and the sailors are only stupid because they say they have seen Iceland. It is only fair to add that there is another argument that the unbeliever may rationally use against miracles, though he himself generally forgets to use it.